So what might an agreement, a legally binding one on plastics, look like? The Federal Environment Minister and Minister for Climate Change, Steven Guilbeault, is with us live from downtown Ottawa as promised. Hi, Minister. Good to see you. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you, Vashi. Very happy to be here.
I wanted to start off on the prospect of an agreement. And basically, in your view, would such an agreement cover the full life cycle of plastic or just focus on the waste management of it?
No, the first part of your question, Vashi. I think there is broad agreement. I would venture to say almost a consensus amongst all of the countries that are here that this international agreement to phase out plastic pollution by 2040 that we're trying to agree upon by the end of the year would have to look at the various stages of plastic production and their impact on the environment and find solution for each of those steps of the plastic production chain.
So that has implications for different types of industries and at different levels. How far off in your prospect? I think I heard you say in your press conference today that you hope to get 70% of the way there, basically by the weekend, and then there's one more final meeting. If you're at 70% on the weekend, where are you at right now?
We're at the very beginning. The negotiating text that we will start working on tomorrow. This is where the technical part of the conference is starting. Was presented at the end of the last session of negotiation in Kenya. So tomorrow it's going to be the first time the countries actually start talking about this new text. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of cleaning up to do. There's multiple options for different proposal, and our role here this week, and Canada as a convener, working with all of these other nations, is to ensure that we can agree on a number of things. They are not, I wouldn't call them easy things, but probably easier things we can agree on quickly, so that we're left at the end of this session in Ottawa with a certain number of smaller number of issues that will need to be hammered out at the last negotiating session, which will take place in South Korea in December.
In layman's terms, what's the actual, outcome, end goal of an agreement? If it's reached, if everyone agrees to it, it's legally blinding. Is it to completely get rid of plastic by a certain time?
It's to get rid of plastic pollution, because we know that plastic play a very important role in our society, whether it's application in the vehicle sector, in airplanes, in the medical sector, electronics. But there are also a number of plastics that we are using where there are alternatives, where we could be using other things, which is why Canada has put in place a ban on single-use plastics. And you know what? A number of countries around the world have done that. And the agreement here is, let's ban those plastics that are very harmful to the environment, and according to science, more and more very impactful to humans. We are finding microplastics in the brain tissue of humans, in the placenta of mothers, in our bloodstreams. Let's get rid of those plastics. Let's get rid of plastics that are very harmful to the environment. Focus on those plastics that play a very essential role in our economy, in our everyday life, and make sure that we keep those plastics in the economy and out of the environment, out of our bodies, by giving those plastics more values, by ensuring, like Canada's doing, that for every plastic that's being produced, a certain percentage of those plastics are made from recycled fibers. We want to get to 50% in Canada. But let's make sure that there's better labeling all around the world, not just here, so that people know what kind of plastics they're using, and that we move towards those plastics that have higher value and that can be reused and reused again.
I'm glad you brought up the ban that your government brought in, because I did want to ask you if the recent federal court decision of late last year has that sort of, essentially ruled that something Cabinet had decided on that underpinned that ban was constituted overreach. Has that undermined your negotiating position at these meetings?
Actually, Vashi, the federal court judge didn't rule that it was federal overreach. They said that judge said that there was, in her view, there wasn't enough scientific evidence to talk about plastics as toxic products. And I respectfully disagree with that federal court judge, which is why we've appealed with the Federal Court of Appeal, and we've asked for a stay of that ruling. So the regulation still applies. And I've never, in my career as an environmentalist, heard from so many scientists since that ruling came out that have said, name the place, name the time, I will come and testify to any judge, to any body of parliament or whoever about the toxicity of plastics on the environment, the toxicity of plastics on the human body. So we're confident that we will be able to win that appeal in the federal court. But that's, we won't ban our way out of plastic pollution. I mean, we can ban certain products, but we need to get better at recycling. We need to get better at designing these products from the get-go so that they can be recycled again and again and again, and keep those products out of our environment. So no one thinks that we can ban our way out of plastic pollution. We can't recycle our way out of plastic pollution. We have to adopt a number of different solutions for different stages of plastic pollution and for different types of plastics as well.
Sure. Just to respectfully challenge you, though, Minister, my understanding and what I've read from the decision itself was that basically Ottawa had overstepped by labeling all quote-unquote plastic manufactured items as toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Evidence shows thousands of different items in that category have different uses and chemical makeups, and basically you couldn't just arbitrarily say all of them constitute the exact same level of toxicity. Is there any way to address that rather than just ask for, appeal and ask for a stay? And does the ban just continue as is in the interim?
I think you and I agree that the federal court judge didn't say that the federal government was overreaching on plastics. She disagreed with the characterization of plastics as toxics. This is what we will be debating in the federal. Yeah, exactly. We stand by that regulation. In fact, the regulation still applies in Canada. There is a stay of that federal court judge ruling, so the ban still applies in Canada, and we're seeing companies move ahead with this. I recently visited Labatt facility. Labatt has already eliminated plastic rings for beer cans in Canada and found a replacement, and they're very happy about it. We're seeing, yesterday I was meeting with CEOs from international company, Coca-Cola, Unilever, Dow Chemicals. You know what they're saying? They say we want an internationally legally binding treaty to eliminate plastic pollution. The industry is on board, scientists are on board, the vast majority of governments are on board. Frankly, besides the Conservative Party of Canada, who said that if they were in power, they would cancel this UN meeting to fight plastic pollution. But beside the Conservative Party of Canada, pretty much everyone is on board with the fact that we need to do this, and the time to do it is now.
Minister, I just want to switch gears before I let you go about another issue. We were just speaking to two auto industry experts about this potential deal. I know that you're not going to reveal the contents of it because it's a few days away. But tied into that deal and that sort of future around electric vehicles is government investment and also government regulations that you have largely overseen, basically how fast we get to all the cars being sold in Canada being electric vehicle associated in some way. How worried are you about the decline in demand that we've seen over the past number of months, and how will you address that?
Well, two things I'd like to say. I heard one of your speakers say that we were more ambitious than the U.S. on that. That's not exactly true. In the first few years of the implementation of our regulations, we are actually catching up to more ambitious U.S. regulations. By 2035, we should be roughly on par with where the Americans want to be with their own regulations on electric vehicles. I mean, what we're seeing is not a decline in the sales of electric vehicles, but in decline in the speed of adoption of electric vehicles. We've seen globally, and that's certainly been the case in Canada, a very, very rapid adoption of electric vehicles. A few years ago, about 2.5 years ago, it was about 3% of sales in Canada. It's now more than 10% of sales overall nationally. 20% of Quebec, so 1 out of 5 vehicles sold in Quebec is an electric vehicle. 1 in 4 in British Columbia. So we are still seeing rapid adoption of electric vehicles, because as price of oil goes up and price of gasoline, like we've seen recently in Ontario and Quebec, more and more people want to liberate themselves from that dependency on oil companies. And gasoline. The price of electricity is much more stable, much cheaper than gasoline. And our assessment and the assessment of agencies like the International Energy Agency is that as time goes by, more and more people will be going towards electric vehicle. The question is, how fast will they move towards EVs?
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. That's why I said it's a decline in demand, not in real terms, because what has happened is that over the past few years, demand did shoot up. And this is where I think those regulations that you've set out, those targets that you set out, are important, because the speed with which demand kind of increases is going to be sort of directly correlated to that. And I'll just put some examples on the table. For example, Ford Motor Company said it was going to delay its EV production at its assembly plant in Oakville by 2 years, from 2025 to 2027. Tesla is recording a decline in quarterly deliveries for the first time in nearly 4 years. GM's CEO Mary Barra referred to the slowdown on an earnings call just a few months ago. She said, if demand conditions change, we'll take advantage of our manufacturing flexibility to build more internal combustion engine models and fewer EVs. Are you willing, if necessary, to amend the targets that you've set out if Canada doesn't, and Canadians don't have the capacity to meet them because of price, because of a lack of charging infrastructure, because of whatever it is?
So that's part of the story, but the other part of the story is that we're seeing more and more competition in the EV sector by foreign producers other than North American producers. And that has certain car companies, North American companies, a bit scared because we are seeing a big influx, not so much in Canada, but certainly in Europe, of electric vehicles, cheaper electric vehicles that are manufactured in certain Asian countries. That's number one. In terms of investment in infrastructure, we have about right now 25,000 public charging stations in Canada, largely funded by the federal government. That number will quadruple in the next four to 5 years. We'll be close to 100,000 by 2029. So we want to make sure that as more and more Canadians adopt electric vehicles, there are more and more charging stations available across the country, keeping in mind that 8 out of 10 Canadians who currently own an electric vehicle charge at home the vast majority of times. But we recognize that there is a real need for public infrastructures, charging infrastructures for people who want to do longer distance, who want to go from cities to cities across the country. But right now, the reality is that the vast majority of people who own an electric vehicle, they charge at home.
But I think the target in order to meet the 2035 goal was something like 448,000 charging stations. There isn't a single person in the industry who has not done an interview on this show in the past number of months saying they are worried about the possibility that that target will not be met, that it's going to feel impossible to reach the 2035 target. And when you already see fluctuations in demand, I guess what I'm wondering on behalf of Canadians is, are you married to the targets you set out for 2035 or the two earlier ones, or is there some flexibility built in there given the flexibility we are seeing in demand?
So the target for 2026 is to be at 20% of sales. As I was saying earlier, we went from 3% to 10%. So sales in Canada have tripled over the last 2.5 years, roughly. So that means continuing increase in sales of EVs. And keep in mind that as more and more companies produce more EVs, there are more models available. The price is coming down for these vehicles. And it's not just a purchase price, but an organization called Clean Energy Canada recently published a study that showed that if you go from an internal combustion engine, a gas engine, to an electric vehicle, you can save up to $3,000 per year on how much it costs to operate a vehicle. So it's not just a cost of purchasing a vehicle. And I think that a number of people who are making the transition from gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids see that there are real savings in their pocketbook for that. And the more people will see that, the more we feel that people will adopt electric vehicles.
Okay, I'll have to leave it on that note. I appreciate making the time this evening, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vashi.